welcome to Taking the Pith podcast, where we'll be talking about Taxi Driver, a 1976 American film directed by Martin Scorsese from a script by Paul Schrader, starring Robert De Niro, Jodie Foster, Harvey Keitel, and Peter Boyle, putting on the Ritz from Young Frankenstein. How I love him. It's a psychological thriller at its heart, but it also has a lot more wider societal relevance and resonance and a critique of the modern world that we live in. Safe to say, I guess, that it's one of the greatest American films of the 20th century, and also maybe safe to say it's probably the greatest work of the creators, Scorsese, Schrader, De Niro. It's actually a part of modern culture in a lot of ways, pop culture. You've got the archetype of the avenging angel, mass shooter, sort of loner, alienated lunatic that we know and love. I guess it's American cinema's counterpart of Albert Camus. I don't know if I'll be pronouncing French as the French pronounce their own language, because it's kind of embarrassing and I can't really do it. So let's go Albert Camus' Outsider, L'Étranger, or Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, or Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. I say Travis Bickle, who is the taxi driver, that's his name, is right up there with those figures, in especially in cinema history. The film has actually had quite a wide influence in pop culture, right from when Travis decides to give himself a mohawk. A year later, all the punk rockers in London started to give themselves mohawks. I think that's pretty safe to say that was a direct influence of the film. And then right up to Ronald Reagan's assassination by Hinckley, who was an ardent admirer of Jodie Foster in the film. Right down to Sheamus and Cesaro in WWE dressing up like Travis Bickle in a tag team match with, I don't know, what's his name, Matt Hardy and the other guy with the horrific hair and the dreadlocks. If you follow wrestling, which I don't, it's a complete coincidence that I know all that, you might recognize them. And this film is another large reason why American politicians tend to be a bit more on edge than their European counterparts, because weapons are so readily available over there. You can understand why they might be a bit edgy. I certainly would be. In this podcast, I'll be discussing the context of the film, the era it was filmed in. I'll discuss the plot, the underlying themes of the film. Then I'm going to talk about the scriptwriter Paul Schrader, and then the director Martin Scorsese, and then the actors, and then I'll finally tie it all up like a kidnapped victim, like Patty Hearst, right at the end, and we'll take it from there. The movie happened during what's called the golden age of New Hollywood, which was an era in Hollywood movies that's considered to be its high point. It kind of kicked off in 1967 with Bonnie and Clyde, and kind of wrapped up around 1980 with Raging Bull. What happened is the Hollywood studios were getting stale. They were just producing old-style epics, and the audiences were either turning to television or getting bored of the epics. Also, the demographics of the viewers were getting younger, so they didn't want to see these corny old films. So the revenues of Hollywood were going way down. I think they lost $500 million in the early 70s. So they kind of panicked and decided to give some new up-and-coming filmmakers a chance. Threw some money at them, and lo and behold, instead of following the tired old routine, these young guys produced what is considered to be the greatest group of films in Hollywood history. It was kind of like a film renaissance. In the same way the 60s was like a musical renaissance. What the filmmakers done, they were called the film school brats. They were all young filmmakers who were very well versed in European art cinema as well as Hollywood movies, and they kind of combined the psychological depth of European art and the cinema and its literature, but they combined it with American dynamism, you know, the excitement of American movies and the violence. And they came up with these series of films. They weren't, unlike the movies before, they weren't producer driven. Before you would have some guy, that's what it's came back to that again. You'd have the producer putting everything together. These were more auteur driven. They were the vision of the director. So surprise, surprise, they were a lot more artistically satisfying. I guess the most famous and major proponents of this new Hollywood era were Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, Brian De Palma. Like I said, they were all from film schools and they had a deep knowledge of the history of cinema and from all over the world. You know, they're more artistic than just journeymen. They broke away from Hollywood cliches. They had a kind of commitment to gritty truth about human society. There was also some technological innovations as well, like the invention of the Panavision Panaflex camera, which allowed them to shoot 35mm film outside, so they weren't sort of tied to shooting in a studio. They could do lots of location shooting. There was also the end of the production code, so you could get a lot more sex and violence and swearing in there, all the stuff we love. So it all gave it a kind of gritty truthfulness to their films. And Taxi Driver is definitely one of the great masterpieces of that time. Kind of everything came together in a perfect storm. You had a brilliant script, brilliant director, and a brilliant lead actor. And it all came together in a labor of love. Everyone involved in the film actually took large pay cuts to get the film made. Like literally, I think Robert De Niro got 35 grand for it when he was being offered $500,000 to perform in another film, and he said no to it. So that's how much they all were keen on this particular project. It's a really great portrayal of the alienation of modern life. It's kind of a confluence of politics, sex, violence, the media, racial tension, masculinity, poverty, relationships, moral corruption, mental pathology, anger, trauma, all that good stuff. It's also a really great portrait of New York City at the height of its decay, when it was almost going bankrupt, even though most of the actual film was shot in Los Angeles, I read. Actually, the era is very important because it happened also after the loss of the Vietnam War, the first war that the Americans had ever lost, and 2 years after the resignation of their president. So it was a really difficult time for the Americans. You know, for such an optimistic culture, I think they were feeling a bit of cynicism. It was in the air. But I think not just Americans, I think everybody can relate to the alienation of the person in the film, not just him, but other people. It just seems to be in the air of modern life. The most famous scene is when he's going, "Are you talking to me?" which actually wasn't in the script, he was improvised. It was improvised, the actual words were improvised by Robert De Niro, and, you know, I think the reason it is so iconic is because many of us have also done the same thing, perhaps not with a gun, but looking into a mirror, practicing for a job interview or some kind of horrible event that you have to prepare yourself for, so we've all kind of done that. There's been a rise even more in alienation, spiritual emptiness, the need for recognition, mass shooters, they're going through the roof, they're really hot right now. And when we look at the psychology of those mass shooters, it's not that different from Travis Bickle, the taxi driver. It's a kind of a need to gain recognition and attention, mainly because they don't have any real close relationships, or like healthy relationships in their lives, and you know they take it out on other people with a weapon. Okay, now I'm going to give a quick summary of the plot. Film set in New York City in 1976. Like I said, New York was on the verge of bankruptcy. The Vietnam War had just ended. Nixon had resigned. They had the OPEC oil crisis about 3 years before. America was having a rough time. It's also the bicentennial year, and it was also an election year when Jimmy Carter would have been elected. So there was a lot going on in 1976. It starts off, Travis Bickle is attending a job interview as a taxi driver, and we find out he's a Marine. He's a Vietnam vet, a Marine who's was honorably discharged, but he can't sleep. And he wants to be a taxi driver because he can't sleep, and he thought he might as well make some money, and he's willing to drive anywhere, which gives him the feeling that he's slightly on edge or reckless or something not quite right with him. Then we hear his voiceover of his diary, and he's complaining about his disgust for the people in New York, and you know how he'd like to wash them all away in a great rain. He's a loner, you know, he drinks constantly, and he basically remains in this routine until one day he sees this woman called Betsy, who's this beautiful blonde woman who's working for a presidential candidate. And he successfully goes up and asks her out, and they go on a few dates. And that goes well up until he decides to take her to a porn movie, and she takes off in disgust and rejects him. While that is going on, one night a young prostitute, underage prostitute, gets into his cab and tries to escape her pimp. But then she's convinced not to leave, and she gets back out again. That plays into later on in the film. Anyway, like I said, he gets rejected by Betsy, and this seems to really affect him greatly. The next scene we see him, he's in a cab, and a guy asks him to turn off the meter, and it's actually Martin Scorsese playing this character who tells Travis Bickle, Robert De Niro, that upstairs in that window his wife is having an affair with a guy, and that he's going to shoot her. And this seems to implant a seed into Travis Bickle's head, because the next scene he buys a bunch of guns, and we see that his mental health, mental well-being is slowly deteriorating. We hear him wrestling with his demons in his voiceover and his diary. It seems that he's undergone a change. He's decided that he's on a mission, and he begins to train his body. He practices using the guns, and he starts stalking the candidate that Betsy was working for, the presidential candidate. This is continuing on until one night he's in a convenience store, and a guy comes in and tries to hold up the convenience store, and Travis shoots him. The guy who runs the convenience store just tells him to leave, don't worry about it, and starts beating the guy with a golf club. So it just really shows just New York was just totally anarchic back then. Then he sees again the young prostitute that got in his cab, and he decides to befriend her. He approaches her pimp and gets to talk with her in a room for a bit, and tries to advise her to leave her life. And she asks him to go with her. She kind of thinks it might be an idea. She's only like 12 years old, and he's trying to convince her to leave her life. She says she might, he should come with her, but he says he's got more important plans. Next time we see him writing a note to the young prostitute, who's called Iris, with some money in it. And then he shows up at the rally for the presidential candidate. All of a sudden he's got a newly shaved mohawk. He's looking rather intimidating, but the Secret Service agents spot him, and he runs off and makes his escape. Next thing, he goes up to Iris's pimp, shoots him in the stomach. sits down for a bit, gets up, goes into where Iris is in the room with a customer, shoots the guy who runs the sort of room in the brothel. The pimp comes in and shoots Travis as well. There's just a big bloodbath. He shoots the customer, he gets shot. Finally the police arrive and he's sitting on a couch covered in blood. He points a finger up to his forehead and sort of pulls the trigger as if he wants to kill himself with a sort of demented smile on his face. The last scene is we hear a voiceover of Iris's, the young prostitute's father, writing a letter to Travis thanking him for helping her to escape her life. And he is still, we find out he still is a taxi driver. He's in the taxi, and Betsy, the woman that he rejected him, gets into his cab and just talks to him, says hello, and then she drives off. He drives off without any talking to her, and that's kind of it. Now I'm going to discuss the themes in Taxi Driver. I'm going to divide them into two categories, the sort of societal themes, and then the themes relating to the individual and the human condition. I think the societal themes in Taxi Driver, they're about the end of innocence in America. You know, and you had that sort of a safety but conformity of the 1950s, and then that real optimism and flowering in the 60s, and then after all the horrible things that happened, you had a new sort of cynicism, pessimism set in. You know, it was the end of that whole kind of Western good guy, bad guy Manichaeanism that America had, perhaps, in some ways. You know, they had, not only had they lost the Vietnam War, but they didn't even feel it was a justified, it was like a shameful war. You know, they feel like the country wasn't on, the soldiers that came back from that war felt that their own country had betrayed them. No other soldiers have really felt that. It's a horrible thing. The Second World War, Korean War, that never happened. First World War, the soldiers were being called baby killers. You know, must have been, it's a very different experience for those, for just the whole country. You know, they just had their president resign after many other leaders were assassinated. You had JFK, so things were building up and getting worse and worse. RFK, Martin Luther King, MLK, all the Ks. There was an oil embargo. Most of all, there's a sort of decay, and the film really shows that of the moral fabric of American and Western society. You know, you've got, like, if you think about what's in the film, child prostitution, there's drugs, illegal gun sales, substance abuse. It's like a complete moral decline. It's also like how another part of the themes perhaps is that, like, technology, how technology can alienate people. You know, the taxi is like this self-contained cell or womb. You know, you just can view humanity as an outsider from it. He just sits in there and is protected. Gary Newman wrote a song about it. Here in my car, I feel I won't sing it. You know, and there's scenes where he's sitting in his grubby apartment watching banal soap operas with a loaded gun pointed at the screen, or he's watching a dance show, and everything, he looks like he's looking at human relationships from the outside looking in. And we can do that nowadays, even more so with social media, where we feel to be connected with other people, but we're not. We're just looking at a screen. We're on our own. So you're probably going to listen to this if you do in the same way. So technology can definitely help to alienate people. Even when he looks at porno films, there's just sort of distancing, objectifying of the whole thing, and it's just really tawdry. So I guess for him, the real motivation is that if he kills this politician, he might get some recognition. He'll get a bit of attention that he may not have got growing up. He certainly doesn't feel that he gets in his day-to-day life. You know, I think a lot of psychologists think one of the best ways to combat mass shooting is just don't mention the name of the shooters on the news, and then they won't have any motivation to do it. If you don't even report anything about them, they'll be completely anonymous. Why would they do it? They do it to get recognized. They do it to get fame, infamy, attention. So whether that will actually happen, who knows? There's a lot of cash in mass shootings, so who knows? There's also another, in the societal tension, you've got the ethnic tensions. In the original film script that Schrader wrote, everybody that Travis was going to kill at the end was going to be black. The pimp was going to be supposed to be black. The customer was supposed to be black. The guy running the brothel was supposed to be black, but then they nixed it because they didn't want to have a riot, they said, after the film. So there is an element of that, and you feel that in the film when he's looking at black people. There's a tension there between them, and there's obviously a lot of that in New York, in America as a whole. It hasn't really gone away either. So I guess that's the kind of the original sin of America. It'll probably never go away. Then on the personal themes of the film, you've got the loneliness. Maybe that's the theme of it, his loneliness. That's what he talks about. Yeah. It's kind of the transference of European existential angst to the American milieu. I wrote that down. It's from an essay by Thomas Wolfe, God's Lonely Man. That's where he gets that phrase that he uses in his diary, in his voiceover. It would even say that perhaps he's not even really mentally ill. He's just a kind of common type that you see in big cities. He's isolated too much. He's got abandonment issues. He might have PTSD from his war experiences. He's got obsessive thinking. He's alienated and isolated, and many of us can recognize elements of him in ourselves, which is why this is more profound than just your typical crime thriller. There's a lot of echoes of that in today's society. Scorsese said there's also a feminist element of it, that he, in a way, Travis Bickle was the end result of toxic masculinity. And if you think of them, these incel people we have today, the way they respond to being rejected by women, going out and shooting people. So a lot of correlation with today's society too. Scorsese says he also wanted to talk about men's inability to relate to women. The way Travis talks about Betsy as some sort of an angel descended from heaven. He doesn't really know how to relate to her. He doesn't have no real empathy for her. He doesn't realize that you don't take a woman on a date to a porn movie and wait till the third date for that. Well, I think it was on the third date he did it, but you just don't do that. He just doesn't seem to understand people, other people, especially women. Like Scorsese said, the most important shot in the film is when he's phoning Betsy, asking her for another date, and she rejects him, and the camera just pans away and shows this empty hallway. He says that's the most profound shot in the film. Well, and one reason that he might not be able to relate to women is he spent so much time in a male environment. He's been in the army, he's a taxi driver, so he doesn't have much experience talking to women. But there's also, there's also women being exploited by men, as in Iris, where she's a child, really. So there's a lot of horrible behavior going on in this film. But maybe the most important theme is just how the lack of human connection and companionship can lead to extremely harmful and pathological behavior. Maybe if Travis had a stable family environment, if he had a wife and kids. I mean, how many of these people that do these mass shootings have a wife and kids and like a normal, healthy family environment? I mean, can we imagine him doing this if he had that sort of like support or normal family environment? So in a way, his entire motivation seems to come from being socially alienated, and rather than mental illness. I mean, it seems the social alienation is causing the mental illness in some ways. Now I'd like to talk about the script and the script writer and the origins of the script. The writer was Paul Schrader. I've seen him in interviews, and seems to be a very neurotic individual. Like he drinks, and then he'll take a drag of a cigarette and he'll go back to his drink, and then he'll scratch his head. He seems a bit OCD. And he's quite a bit of a notoriety. He's got a notorious love of guns. You know, he's quite a conservative person. He believes in the death penalty. And he comes from a very, very troubled childhood. He was born in 1946 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And his father was an executive, but the family were very strict Calvinists, very, very strict religious types, and very, very disciplined. He wasn't allowed to actually look at films until he finally snuck out and saw one when he was 17. Films were deemed sinful. So they were really, really dogmatic religious people. I think his father was a very domineering and oppressive. Like he's mentioned in an interview how Travis is trying to kill the father figure of the politician and then the father figure of the pimp. So he's obviously got some daddy issues. He went to film school, and he actually became a film critic. He was recommended by Pauline Kael. She seemed to take him under his wing. I'm not really sure how they met, or I forget how. And he was a film critic, and he actually wrote a very highly regarded film book on critical theory called Transcendental Style in Film, Ozu, Bresson, and Dreyer. He's very interested in transcendental film, which is trying to express the spiritual side of life through film. Like he wrote about the spiritual minimalism of Ozu and Bresson. Like Bresson's Pickpocket seems to have been the biggest influence on Taxi Driver, because it combined crime drama with a sort of trying to look into deeper spiritual malaise happening in humans. And that kind of happens with films. If you can combine mainstream genre films with a sort of art house sensibility, you can come up with some good stuff. Look at what Jean-Luc Godard did with Abu de Souffle. I found out how to pronounce that. That's what he was doing. The self-awareness of Pulp Fiction. All these things are basically genre films that they've added extra lashings of art house pretentiousness on top. So his big influences are, apart from those three filmmakers I just mentioned, are like John Ford, especially his movie The Searchers, where John Wayne plays a sort of anti-hero who goes to rescue a young woman, even though she doesn't really want to be rescued. Very similar to Travis Bickle. Jean Renoir. He also was, but because he was raised in a non-film going family, his biggest influences are literary. He says he wanted to make a film very similar to Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky, which is a great novel written where the main protagonist is basically belly aching for the entire length of the novel. He wrote the script for Taxi Driver after his marriage had broken down because of infidelity, and he'd lost his job as the film critic. He was living in his car in LA. He was kind of going through an existential crisis. He was eating a lot of junk food, watching porn, basically living like Travis Bickle. And like I said, he got his influence from the book Notes from Underground. At the time this was happening, George Wallace had also had an assassination attempt by him. He was actually crippled by a guy called Arthur Bremer. And there was excerpt of this guy's called The Assassin's Diary in 1973. He wrote a book about, it was very just basically the same thing as Taxi Driver, a diary about how him planning to assassinate George Wallace. But anyway, Paul Schrader was a film critic. He interviewed Brian De Palma, and he mentioned this script that he'd written, and he gave it to Brian De Palma, who liked it, and then decided to sort of circulate it amongst Hollywood people. The reason he came up with the idea of the taxi cab, he thought it was the perfect symbol of urban loneliness. It was only his second script. He wrote it in 15 days. He says it just jumped out of him, like almost complete. The whole thing had been percolating inside and it just came out. What he wanted to do was put a European existential hero, but put him in an American context. Because America, he said, was a bit like a teenage culture. That when Japanese person goes crazy, he'll kill himself. But in America, he'll open up the window and kill somebody else. And he got the idea of the diary and the voiceover from Robert Bresson's Pickpocket. Get another example of the high art and low life mixing, like Jean Genet's Thief's Journal or Our Lady of the Flowers. There's also an element of him coming from a very repressed Protestant background, and Scorsese having a Northern European, because actually Paul Schrader is Dutch origin. I kind of assumed he was Jewish because of his name, and he kind of looks Jewish, but he isn't. He's from a Dutch background and a very Calvinist Protestant background, where Scorsese is obviously Southern Italian, Sicilian, and much more expressive and Catholic background. So it's a really interesting mixture of European sensibilities there, the sort of Northern Protestant and Southern Catholic cultures in the film, even though basically it's a quintessentially New York film. Travis Bickle is supposed to be Midwestern Protestant. The person they had planned to play it was Jeff Daniels, of all people, the Big Lebowski, which is kind of mean, are you talking to me? Well, that's just your opinion, man, or something. So, there's a kind of, if you think of the film, it's a bit of a combination, apart from your regular American violent movie. It's a bit like Bergman meets Fellini. It's very expressive, and yeah, there's a coldness to it too. What happened is Schrader saw Mean Streets and just realized this is a filmmaker, and De Niro is the guy who should play Travis Bickle, and they got together through Brian De Palma, I think. The director is Martin Scorsese, very well-known American director. He was born in 1942 in New York, grew up in Little Italy. His parents were working-class Italians, but they worked in the garment industry, but they were also amateur actors. He was raised in a very devout Catholic household, and he was kind of a sickly child because he had asthma. So he spent a lot of his time going to movies. He was very influenced by Italian neorealism and European cinema. He was really influenced by, stylistically anyway, Paul and Pressburger movies. If you see the use of colours by the cinematographer Jack Cardiff, you can see that in his later films. He had the idea of becoming a priest, but he gave that up and decided to study film in New York University. He kind of got embroiled in the whole Greenwich Village filmmaking scene, where he met Brian De Palma, who actually introduced him to Robert De Niro. I watched Wedding Party, which is a 1963 film by De Palma that has a 20-year-old Robert De Niro in it, and he looks really pudgy. And he also looks like one of the Beastie Boys, Ad Rock, I think. But anyway, Scorsese sort of worked his way up. He was the editor or something on Woodstock, the film. So he finally made Mean Streets, which was his calling card, which starred De Niro. It was shot on location, not in studios, and many of those classic Scorsese tropes, you know, themes of redemption, of sin and faith, kind of documentary feel with some stylized elements. And it was also about life among the underclasses or the outcasts of society. And he revisited a lot of those themes in Taxi Driver. Stylistically, I think Scorsese and all the new Hollywood films were influenced by the sort of innovative guerrilla filmmaking of Jean-Luc Godard, the whole French New Wave. I mean, even though a lot of the films may not be that enjoyable to watch, they were incredibly influential technically. Maybe in the same way I think that like James Joyce's books are not exactly pleasant to read, some of them, but formally they were very, very innovative. And that's what just jump cuts, the way things were, it just was total freedom. It was just getting out, away from the studio, just filming on the street without any regard for your typical aesthetic perimeters. It's kind of like the punk rock of film movements, or Dogma 95 would be a more modern version of it. I mean, the whole Nouvelle Vague, French New Wave, had an influence on 60s culture as well. The whole mods and all that, they were all trying to look French, you know. And it was like I said, it wasn't just entertainment. There had a lot of of intellectual depth to the films, critical distance. You didn't just look at it as a film. You were aware of the fact you were looking at a film. So there's a lot of irony in it as well. The big innovative technical thing that happened is the Steadicam, where you were able to film in natural light outside. It actually feels like you're in the film, not in a. So it becomes less like a theater and more that you're actually in the film, cinema verite. If you think about it, Taxi Driver was only 16 years after A Bout de Souffle, Breathless by Jean-Luc Godard, so it was hardly anything, hardly any time whatsoever. I can see the influence in Taxi Driver of Louis Malle's Elevator to the Scaffold, with the Miles Davis soundtrack, the same sort of jazz soundtrack with the city, the big city, and it's wet a lot of the time, and I feel a bit of that in that, you know, kind of echoes Bernard Herrmann's jazz soundtrack with the urban landscape. When they filmed the taxi scenes, they actually used a real taxi. The sound man got in the back, the camera man and Martin Scorsese got in the back, and they just filmed from the back seat. They filmed Robert De Niro because they couldn't afford. They didn't even use like a truck or anything like that. It was just they were in the taxi. You know, that the Travis's and Iris's apartments were built in actual condemned buildings. So it was really filmmaking on the fly. And Scorsese, you know, he knows his milieu. I'm going to use that word again. So he really knew how to give it a real New York feel, you know, that Schrader wasn't as familiar with New York, but, you know, Scorsese knew about the grittiness. You can just feel the heat rising up and the violence in the air and the constant threat. There's also a sort of transcendental spiritual aspect that him and Schrader, they got from Bresson. There's a kind of dreamlike quality of the filming. You know, there's a lot of slow motion. They use slow-mo, like when they filmed the close-ups of Robert De Niro, everyone that he isn't speaking in, they use 48 frames per second, so it's in slow motion when they're doing that. They give it that kind of dreamlike, surreal quality, like you're in a kind of a nightmare or a dream. And the colors are very similar to the Powell Pressburger movies, where they're used expressionistically, a lot of red, you know, similar to the colors that you get in old master paintings as well, colors you get in Catholic churches. The lighting, a lot of the time, has that aspect to it. The slow motion, all of that. It doesn't make it like a straight-ahead narrative film. There's a lot of artificial aesthetic effects to affect the viewer. He uses the neon lighting, the way it would light the entire scene. And there's a lot of use of water, reflection, steam. It's really beautiful to look at in some ways, especially some scenes. Yeah, now I'd like to talk about the acting in the film. I think we could arguably say it's De Niro's most iconic role after Dirty Grandpa. I think I said before it could have been Jeff Bridges, but it wasn't. Thing is, De Niro, I read, had the idea to write a similar screenplay about this lonely kid that walks around with a gun and hangs around the UN and wants to assassinate people. That's why he was so drawn to the actual script. And I guess him being creative, he kind of understood the need for recognition. A lot of creative people have. But assassins don't have a creative outlet other than shooting George Wallace. So, as the usual De Niro thing, he did a lot of research. He went to army camps to come up with Travis's accent. He drove a cab for a couple of weeks. And in fact, one guy in the cab, De Niro had just won the Oscar for Godfather Part 2 the year before. And the passenger was also an actor, and he saw De Niro driving the cab. I thought, wow, that, times change, or I can't remember. My brain's not working. Doesn't matter. So, with Robert De Niro, he was born in Greenwich Village in 1943. He's only a quarter Italian, even though people assume that he's, pure Brooklyn Italian American, born and bred. He actually grew up in a very bohemian. Both his parents were artists. His father was gay and divorced his mum when he was 2, even though they were very close afterwards, Robert De Niro, and his mum was still close to them. And he grew up in a very bohemian atmosphere. He went to private schools, but he also hung around with the street kids in downtown Manhattan. But like I said, he's a quarter Italian. Actually, Sylvester Stallone, Bon Jovi, Sylvester Stallone's half Italian. Bon Jovi is a quarter or half Italian. John Travolta's a quarter or half Italian. Steven Tyler is completely Italian, and Bruce Springsteen is more Italian than the other lot. He's only half, so, don't let the last names or their personas fool you. He's famous for the Stanislavski system. Robert De Niro, is you use your life experiences to motivate the production of emotions. Things that happen to you that bring up emotions within you can then drive you in the scene that you're acting in. He's also part of, post-war American actor, which a lot of people think begins with Marlon Brando. I mean, before Marlon Brando, actors like proclaimed like they were on stage. Brando made it much more intimate. He was famous for mumbling all the time. In fact, he's the inventor of the soft-spoken tough guy. So every time you see one of these guys in American films, who's like James Dean, Clint Eastwood, Bruce Willis, Robert De Niro, Michael Madsen, Jason Statham, Steven Seagal, Mickey Rourke, they're all doing it. They're all doing what Marlon Brando did, which is, I'm a tough guy, but I'm really soft-spoken, That was Marlon who came up with that one. In Taxi Driver, De Niro makes Travis really likable. That's one thing I think we can say about the character. He's much more likable than probably the real-life Travis Bickle would be. We care about Travis Bickle. There's a kind of mystery to him. We don't know anything about his background. That was intentional. Paul Schrader planned that. And he's also got charisma as well. that we can understand why Betsy would actually go on a date with him. He has something about him. When he does his voiceover, it's really wistful and melancholic. You know, even when he's talking about wiping away all the scum and killing, you know, it doesn't really sound that ugly for some reason. What he did is he got Paul Schrader, De Niro got Paul Schrader to read the diary, recorded it and listened to it, and people remarked just how similar Travis's mannerisms were to Schrader. He wore Schrader's shirt and his boots and his belt while he was performing as Travis. There's a kind of boy next door quality to Travis too. You know, there's just, I don't know, he doesn't come across as a really nasty, evil human being. Maybe he degenerates more and more throughout the film. Like when he gets his army haircut, he looks more severe. And you start to see, you know, him becoming. And then when he finally gets his mohawk, he doesn't even seem. He seems just like a caricature of this, like almost like Nosferatu or something. And even when you see him when he walks like a robot. He moves his head the same as his shoulders. He doesn't move his head separated from his shoulders. It's a really weird way of walking, I noticed in the scene. There's something repulsive about him. When they have the shootout at the end, when he shoots the pimp and the customers and the brothel guy, you know, it's really prosaic. You know, he shoots the pimp and then he sits down to decide what to do, and then he goes in and starts shooting the brothel owner. And it comes across as real, you know, not stylized, like that might actually happen in real life. It's real and yet dreamlike at the same time. Like De Niro, he's got a menace, and there's a softness about him too. Like I imagine, like Al Pacino played the role, it wouldn't be as melancholy, it'd be more fiery, you know. Where De Niro has more of a sort of avenging angel rather than psychopath about him. You know, we can even believe that he's slightly redeemed at the end. You know, because the overriding theme of the film is loneliness and alienation. De Niro, he makes us like and empathize with Travis. You know, we certainly don't feel revulsion, even though we should, after what he's done. So he is great in it, but you know, there's a lot of other good performances in it. Jodie Foster, in the film, she seems like an 18-year-old portraying a 16-year-old, but she's actually a 12-year-old playing a 12-year-old. So, I mean, she's just, I mean, I don't know many 12-year-old actors could have pulled that off. Her dialogue actually was, Schrader came up with it. He was out drinking. He was an alcoholic and a complete substance abuse. They all were, I think. Him and Scorsese were on the cocaine non-stop. And he was out one night in New York, and he said in a bar of ill repute, he just happened to walk in there by accident or something. Yeah, right. And he went home with a girl who turned out to be an underage prostitute. And the next morning, he phoned up Scorsese and Harvey Keitel, and they came over and interviewed this girl. She's just a young girl, to get information about him, and that's where they got a lot of dialogue for Iris, was from this girl. And the whole dancing thing, the pimp dancing with her, that was from that, when they were all together in this hotel room, sort of grilling this underage prostitute. This underage prostitute, her name is Garth or something. She's actually in the film. She's the young girl that is with Iris in every scene. The other prostitute that's with her, young blonde girl. So she's actually in the film. So then you've got Harvey Keitel playing the Puerto Rican pimp guy, who has a waspy name for some reason. He researched with pimps. I don't know what he did exactly. Hopefully he didn't, put any, put Danny DeVito out on the game or something like that. That wouldn't be good. But he does a very good job of they show the codependency in sort of the pimp prostitute relationship, and how pimps manipulate women. You know, when he's dancing with Iris and saying he loves her and all that stuff. You know, that's fair. And then there's Peter Boyle, plays Wizard, you know, putting on a Ritz. One of the greatest bald actors of all time. You know, he was proud of that hair sticking out of the side of his head, unlike Yul Brynner and Telly Savalas and Jason Statham. He proudly hung on to it. Good for him. And actually, lastly, Scorsese himself plays the guy customer in the back of the cab telling Travis that he's going to shoot his wife because the actor who was going to play that got sick. And Scorsese said, what the hell, I might as well give it a go. And I think he's really, really great in it. He really kind of is scary and very convincing. Well, I think Taxi Driver is definitely one of the great American films. You know, it's a cinematic version of Dostoevsky's Note from Underground, Camus' L'Étranger, The Outsider. Every time you see a mass shooting in the news, it's invoked. It's kind of a great poetic vision about the dark side of the human condition. A film about the discarded people in society, the alienation of the big city, our need for companionship. Why alienated people are drawn to the big city. You know, we can recognize Travis's motivations, you know, the need for purpose, feel a sense of worth. Everything Travis does, he thinks he's doing it to become a hero. The sense of disgust he feels for society that he feels lets him down. His family's let him down, the army let him down, the government let him down, women have let him down, everything's let him down, and he wants to get vengeance. But if we're honest, it's himself who's let himself down, you know. At the end, we hope that he might choose a different path. You know, it's basically a study in misanthropic and muddled subjective thinking. You know, he lacks empathy. For example, we can't see why Betsy might not want to go to a porn film. You know, he's caught up in his own twisted, unhealthy thoughts. He judges lots of other people and their actions, but he doesn't judge his own. He's an iconic modern protagonist of our culture. He symbolizes morbidity, obsession, helplessness, impotency, anger, the antisocial urge that we have, the desire for violent revenge against the society and anyone who harms us. You know, he's the poster child for that. There are actually a lot of people have posters of him on their wall that feel the same way. But with all that, the film has a really beautiful, dreamlike visual quality. You know, it's melancholy, there's pathos, there's humour. Most of all, it's got a truth in it. You know, we all have a bit of Travis Bickle in us. We practice speaking in the mirror before a job interview or going to school for a school bully, or the kind of things we do. We've all had our emotions affected by modern technology and the media, life itself. There's a lot of ugliness in the film, but it still seems beautiful and poetic because there is truth in it. Maybe there's too much truth in it. There's one last snippet of information. When Reagan had his assassination attempt, the FBI questioned Scorsese and Schrader to see if Hinckley, the guy who made the assassination attempt, had contacted them. And he had actually contacted Schrader a couple of times prior to the assassination attempt, but Schrader lied to the FBI. You know, he admitted this in an interview, along with admitting that he solicited underage prostitutes. So I guess my biggest advice to Paul Schrader is stop doing interviews, especially incredibly intoxicated. Thank you for listening to Taking the Pith podcast about Taxi Driver.